Good evening. So over the past week or so, as people have been away for Christmas, generally celebrating the holidays, preparing for New Year's, a lot has been going on YouTube. Of course, there's the whole Kraut and Tea drama, the implosion of the skeptic community, but for those of us who are more interested in ideas and less interested in internet drama, this Christmas season has been host to a variety of really fascinating interactions and conversations between parties that was really hard to even imagine talking together even a month ago. And the facilitator of these conversations has been none other than the channel Millenniyule Woes, a fairly large alt-right channel. Now, for those familiar with Millenniyule Woes, he is a vlogger, notable for his contemplative and melancholic style combined with some very radical positions on race and reaction. But Millenniyule Woes' yearly content output is typically punctuated every year by something he calls the Millenniyule, pun intended. But during this time, basically throughout all of December, well into the new year, he interviews almost everybody from the right or anybody who's willing to talk to the alt-right. This Millenniyule usually comprises an enormous amount of live streams with a very diverse number of people. Of course, you get all of the alt-right channels basically just running plugs of their usual content, and those are very boring. I don't usually like to hear alt-righters bellyache about the state of the world. I know I bellyache about the state of the world, but it's just not my bag. But the far more interesting side of Millenniyule Woes' little yearly get-together is when he interviews dissenting voices, people who don't like the alt-right perspective, his critics. And that's very much part of his yearly rundown. And in this year, Millenniyule Woes went overboard. I think he had about 66 to 70 interviews. It was really insane. It was like 4 a day. And inside that mix, you had a variety of very interesting interactions, especially with his critics. And this year in particular, the Millenniyule was sort of bookended by this constellation of interviews with alt-right critics. Starting first, of course, with Millenniyule Woes' interview of Sargon of Akkad, which I've mentioned in passing. I even talked to Sargon about it several days after he went on Millenniyule Woes' channel to discuss the alt-right with Millenniyule Woes. It was an interesting conversation, and in most years, I would say it would probably be the most interesting of any of the people that Millenniyule Woes would interview, because the rest of them would typically be alt-right yes men. But not in 2017, because it got better. About 2 days before Christmas, Millenniyule Woes went ahead and interviewed Michael Isaacson, a radical left-wing professor affiliated with Antifa of all organizations, who had got himself embroiled in controversy by voicing anti-police sentiments at his university. At the time of Isaacson's own controversy, Millenniyule Woes had created an extended video commenting on this strange person and creating a sort of disparaging perspective on the Antifa type in general. And I think during that video, he tossed out a random invitation to Isaacson to come on his channel and discuss, probably never expecting Isaacson to actually take up the offer. But lo and behold, in contravention of everything anyone's ever seen on YouTube of progressives generally not taking invites to debate, Professor Michael Isaacson took Millenniyule Woes up and appeared on a rather long interview halfway through the Millenniyule interviews. The interaction was fascinating enough, but not even as fascinating as one of the final interviews that Millenniyule Woes gave to V. Monroe, a channel affiliated with Sargon, talking about the alt-right and Millenniyule Woes' own interaction with Isaacson. Now, I know this sounds very meta, but I'll try to set this up, because I think in these interactions, you see sort of the interplay of a lot of different forces. The alt-right versus the progressive perspective on the universe, and how liberalism and sort of the radical liberalism of Sargon of Akkad and V. Monroe tries to rationalize these two things, and how I think it really gets it wrong. So at this point, I'm going to sort of take the opportunity to do a 3-part after-action analysis on these 3 conversations. I hope it's not going to go too long, because I think the point is succinct enough. And probably at some point I'm going to have to do a more serious video on this, or explore these ideas in yet another live stream with either Sargon or V. Monroe. But anyway, let's start off, because I think we can start by discussing the most standard conversation. Probably it would have been very controversial 1 or 2 years ago, but really the the interaction that kicked off this series was Sargon discussing the alt-right with Millennial Woes. Now, Sargon had come on Millennial Woes' channel several times before, and the interactions were always really underwhelming. There wasn't really a lot to talk about. But this time, Sargon was really pushing hard this horseshoe theory idea. Now, for those listeners who are not familiar with horseshoe theory, this is this is a popular theory among liberals and moderates that sort of believe the political spectrum is not just left versus right, but indeed the left and the right sort of curve into their authoritarian dimensions and become more similar in the extremes than they are in the moderation, hence sort of the horseshoe shape, where as you go further apart at the very ends, you get closer together. And this is generally sort of used to express the similarity between, say, a Stalin and a Hitler. They were both authoritarian, although they were both on extremes of left and right. And this is a very comforting way of depicting things if you consider yourself a moderate, because you get to sit at the bottom of the horseshoe going, herder, I'm sort of off the good side of the horseshoe, the one that's the moderate, the one that's the anti-authoritarian. Now, this is something that liberals and moderates oftentimes discuss amongst themselves, and they use this theory to flatter their own egos. It rarely ever comes up in discussions with actual right-wing extremists, but this time, Sargon felt he had a version of this theory that he could not only tell to his allies and friends, but literally sell to a radical right-winger himself. And so you had Sargon go into the stream with Millennial Woes, actually recommending that Millennial Woes learn how to speak social justice and ally with progressive identity politics, perhaps hoping that white identity politics, being a form of identity politics, would naturally find a home on the left, who have come to favor all identity politics except white identity politics. This recommendation has sort of another ridiculous dimension to it, which is that Sargon on a previous stream had said that this would be the perfect idea to get both the left and the alt-right to destroy themselves. So anyone who had been attentive to Sargon's other pronouncements would have noticed that Sargon was trying to sell Millennial Woes a lemon. He was basically saying, why don't you and him fight? Why don't you and the progressives go and mutually destroy each other? Band together with your identity politics, show the world that you're intellectual frauds, and then let liberals inherit the earth. And I know that sounds incredibly condescending, and to a certain degree, Sargon's suggestions were a little condescending, but Sargon being Sargon, he made it sound, his natural charisma made it sound at least a little bit palatable in the conversation with Woes, as it actually occurred when he engaged in the conversation. In short, he made a bad idea sound really good, but it wasn't really well received by the alt-right or even really by the skeptics. But Sargon had it in his mind that this horseshoe theory perspective, where you could lump the alt-right in with the progressives because they both liked racial identity politics, he thought that this idea was a winner, and for some reason, this livestream convinced himself that this idea was a winner. A weird livestream, sure. Very interesting, but I have to admit, it wasn't really revolutionary. It wasn't incredibly interesting. But what was incredibly interesting was the interaction that would take place only 3 weeks later, where indeed the two ends of the horseshoe did in fact meet in a live stream on Millennial Woes' channel. This, of course, is the meeting between Millennial Woes and the Antifa supporting Professor Michael Isaacson. Now, what can be said about this meeting of minds? The only thing I could think of when I was watching the live stream was the word perverse. And I mean the word perverse or perversity in the full Slavoj Zizek critical theory sense of the word. We were seeing here an interaction that totally disrupted our norms of conversation, that sort of twisted them in this really, really strange way. The roles between authority and anarchy were blurred. The roles between the masculine and the feminine nature were sort of inverted. And this sounds overly symbolic, but I'll try to explain. So in this interview, most people expected it to be coming to blows in short order, but actually what persisted was a fairly civil conversation where Millennial Woes asked basic questions, interview-style questions to Michael Isaacson, who was incredibly passive himself. But what kind of came out of this was Millennial Woes, in a sort of reserved but masculine way, asking permission or or asking the bounds by which he could express his own opinions without expecting some retaliation of violence from the party of Michael Isaacson, who was responding in the most passive and passive-aggressive and even effeminate manner. And I know Millennial Woes has a more or less radical racialist politics that I don't subscribe to, but in the conversation, a lot of it just concerned general traditionalist concepts of gender norms, group dynamics, and the coherency of ethnicities and customs. Things that would have been non-controversial in any other age. And the conversation as it played out was order asking anarchy, where it might have permission to be orderly. It was the firm and masculine voice asking the reserved and feminine when the reserved and feminine expected to dole out violence against the masculine force. And this created this ridiculous environment and mode in which the conversation took place. One point that sort of struck me in particular is when Millennial Woes asks sort of in this direct, manly fashion, so if I express my opinions, could I expect you to hit me in the face for expressing them? You know, a very direct question, as you'd expect some classical gentleman to ask it. And, you know, Michael Isaacson, who's on previous occasions supported using violence against people expressing alt-right views, answers in the most meandering way imaginable. I think he says something like, well, I guess I wouldn't do it because, you know, I'm weak, but, you know, I probably would try to get somebody else to do it, you know, if it was convenient or strategic. And when I heard that, my face just went into my palms. It's a total inversion of everything we should expect civilized society to procure. I mean, having an opponent who will smack you in the head for having the wrong views is bad enough, but having one who does it in such a passive-aggressive fashion that they can't even take full ownership of what they advocate for, is just insulting on a really deep level. But I suppose at this point it's just details, because although a lot of people expected a huge conflict between these characters, there really wasn't one. Millennial Woes asked direct questions, Isaacson answered them, and as perverse and twisted as the dynamic between the personalities was, and the dynamic of the implied violence was, at no point did you get the sense that Millennial Woes was really angry. There were a few moments, no doubt, where Millennial Woes sort of laid down a line in the sand, where he said, like, how dare you threaten me, or don't say my ethnicity doesn't exist. But that didn't really erupt into any moment where you felt that Millennial Woes was really losing control, was really getting angry. The two came to their biggest ideological disagreements really early, and I think at that moment they determined that they were just fundamentally viewing the world in different ways. And from that portion of the talk onward, they were just discussing bounds, bright lines, ways that they could sort of divvy up the world so that their two totally conflicting views of the world had to encounter each other the absolute minimum amount. It was more like a negotiation than anything else in the last portion of the talk. And through this sort of weird negotiation between these really different personalities, there were indeed details where the two came to an agreement or had very similar agreements or disagreements on. Isaacson was doing the typical leftist thing where he was sort of probing these little leading questions to the right winger, trying to uncover some moment where he could go into some gotcha on a particular point. And Millennial Woes, like the typical right-winger, was looking for some kind of demarcation, some kind of boundary that he could count on Isaacson not crossing under any circumstances. And of course, both parties came up short. You know, Isaacson never gave Millennial Woes a particular boundary, and Millennial Woes never gave Isaacson the kind of red meat that all the progressives seem to live for. But, you know, in the interim, you got all sorts of details where they didn't quite disagree on. You know, Millennial Woes voted against Scottish independence, even though he's supposed to be a nationalist. Neither Isaacson nor Millennial Woes care about Israel one way or the other. They're more or less ambivalent about it. And in superficial terms, each party has situations in the world today where they think some separatism amongst people is preferable, and they think some integration or unification under a common empire is preferable. The two pertinent examples in the talk, of course, were Scotland and Israel. Now, as soon as I saw this talk, talk, I knew I had to do some kind of after-action analysis. And for the most part, I thought I'd probably spend more time talking about the intense difference between their worldviews and the sort of perversity of the violence dynamic, essentially placing the anarchist position over the traditionalist one. But before I could even draw up an outline for any kind of video, I saw that Sargon of Akkad had sort of released a follow-up only hours later with one of his well-known YouTube associates, V. Monroe. And in this, Sargon and V were just cracking out the champagne, patting each other on the back. This dialogue between Isaacson and Millenniyule Woes, this is the horseshoe theory confirmed. Look, neither of them can really keep straight exactly how they want national dynamics to work out. They both have similarly incoherent opinions on exactly where national boundaries should be drawn. And both of the people in the conversation, both Millenniyule Woes and Michael Isaacson, had deep skepticism and reservation about liberty. And of course, by the horseshoe theory, this means that their worldviews at some level must be the same, or really so similar it's not worth really drawing up a huge distinction. And of course, to put sort of the cherry on top of this liberal triumphalism, V. Monroe himself, several days later, appeared on Millenniyule Woes' channel to discuss this in what must have been an unscheduled conversation in the Millenniyule interview setup. And here, just like Sargon, but in a much more colorful fashion, V. Monroe literally tries to make Millenniyule Woes eat the horseshoe theory. He literally tries to make him admit that the left and the right are one and the same in their extreme forms. But unlike Sargon, this attempt is not at all dignified or charismatic, and it comes off as one conversational train wreck of epic proportions. If anyone's looking for an entertaining live stream to listen to, go listen to V. Monroe and Millenniyule Woes discuss this stuff, because I haven't heard anything like it in a really long time. And of course, for everyone who's ever heard V. Monroe's YouTube channel, they know it's just full of profanity. So I asked my listeners to forgive me right now if I repeat some of the profanity. I think in some ways it's necessary to illustrate this, but all throughout this conversation, V. Monroe is saying the alt-right has their moral faggotry and the left has their moral faggotry, and it's all the same. It all limits liberty. You know, he says this in the Romanian accent. And every time Millenniyule Woes tries to sort of repost off of this, he kind of hits back with a slogan. I think one of his favorite ones was something along the lines of, "Your moral faggotry does not get to tell me what I can do with my dick," you know, something profane like that. And you can tell, unlike the other two conversations Millenniyule Woes had with either Sargon or Isaacson, as this conversation is going forward, Millenniyule Woes is becoming totally enraged. You can almost hear the guy's fingernails just like curl up on his mouse pad. This conversation is obviously irritating him. And at some point, at the fourth or fifth time where he's been told his identity politics or traditionalist concepts have been shot down by V. Monroe insisting that his moral faggotry can't tell him what to do with his dick, I think Millenniyule Woes just shouts at the microphone, "Am I talking to V or V's dick in this conversation?" And of course, it all goes down from there. You know, V isn't saying anything that we haven't heard before. He's an advocate of pure liberty, pure liberalism. He, in many ways, is between Antifa and Millenniyule Woes, certainly a moderate. And of course, the conversation goes down from there. But, you know, the question I kind of thought was the most entertaining after listening to this is, given that V is, in some sense, a moderate, I think the most interesting question coming out of this conversation was, why was this last interaction by far the most hostile one? Even though it's arguable that the differences in political position were the least extreme. I mean, I guess putting aside charisma, one possible explanation indeed might be that the rapport people had amongst themselves, that Millenniyule Woes essentially had with either of these three people, just came down to charisma. But I don't know. I mean, of all the three people he interviewed, Sargon was the only one that had what I would consider charisma. And although V. Monroe can be incredibly irritating with his profanity and his grating Romanian accent, when you compare him to the insufferable, effeminate, passive-aggressive Michael Isaacson, I think there's no contest. I mean, as grating as V's voice is, I would much rather get a beer with him than go anywhere near people like Michael Isaacson. But at the risk of sounding too pretentious in this, I would go ahead and say that the central difficulty is ideological. I think indeed Millenniyule Woes was not angry because of any personality quality. He was actually angry at the ideological position being presented. And I think in order to get this analysis, you really have to talk about how these three positions relate to each other. Because I think that Sargon's analysis of the relationship between the far left and the alt-right has sort of a fundamental flaw to it. He's mistaken something that is superficial for what is actually going on in the disagreement. And this comes down to something I talked to Sargon about during our live stream, but that I've had a very difficult time putting into words or expressing anywhere on YouTube, even after 6 or so videos on the alt-right and what was wrong with it. And that is simply that what people on the alt-right care about and what people in the various identitarian-based movements of the left care about is not race. Race does not actually matter to the alt-right at a psychological level. Race is the vehicle that these two sides are using to fight over a much more fundamental question about human nature and how human society should operate. At the end of the day, I believe very sincerely that the left and right divide is one of order versus chaos. I know there's a limitation in all of these one-dimensional discussions of whether someone's on the right or the left, but the division psychologically and philosophically between someone like Millenniyule Woes and someone like Michael Isaacson is very real indeed. Millenniyule Woes wants to preserve normative and traditional society. He wants to have a society that has meaning, that has metaphysical notions of truth, goodness, and beauty that are intact, and that are, in some sense, socially objective, if not metaphysically objective. I know Woes is an atheist, so the whole metaphysically objective thing might prove some problems, but at the end of the day, atheist or not, he wants the qualities of truth, goodness, and beauty to be socially objective, and he wants standard tradition to carry forward these concepts into the future, far after he's died. Michael Isaacson, on the other hand, and here Michael Isaacson is very much an archetype of the left, wants all of these normative categories destroyed and liquidated. He wants to have essentially no social objectivity. He wants to have most notions of meaning emptied, individuated out of existence, blurred to the point where they have no consistent actual meaning. He wants the world described in John Lennon's Imagine, where there's nothing to live or die for. He wants a system where chaotic and disordered notions of meaning always are dominant over ordered and consistent ones. And that is the difference between the positions. It's a difference that has nothing to do with race. Indeed, this was mainly the reason why a lot of the more minor designations of where national borders began or ended really didn't matter to Millenniyule Woes, or to Michael Isaacson for that matter. Did it matter whether Scotland gained its independence from the British Empire or not? Did it matter whether whites could break off from the United States and form an ethno-state or not? Well, in both cases, both of those propositions are just vehicles for the previous difference in worldviews. One independence movement might necessarily make the world more traditional and more ordered towards objective notions of meaning, in which case Woes would prefer it. Another independence movement might make the world more amenable to displacement of traditional norms, in which case Isaacson seemed in favor of it. Their preference for separatist movements, racialist or otherwise, were simply an extension of larger metaphysical preferences. And so when Sargon and V saw these little agreements and these small little hypocrisies, they were seeing less the culmination of some advanced horseshoe theory and really just the gaps, the portions of the philosophy where the superficial outer explanations of what they believed in failed to really cover what they truly believed in. What they truly believed in, but what was hard to express. Left-wingers will support the racial separatism of different groups, as long as that separatism can be used to tear down a traditional and ordered concept of meaning. And right-wingers will support the integration of many ethnicities into an empire, as long as that integration supports and upholds the flowering of an ordered and consistent view of meaning and morality. It's at the base of what these people want, even if they're not quite able to admit it to themselves, or lack the philosophical sophistication to interrogate those desires. Now here I want to see if I could not indulge my listeners in a slight digression. Now, anyone who's listened to alt-right channels for any consistent amount of time have heard the classic K versus R type distinction they make. Now, this K versus R type distinction is sort of a pseudoscience thing. It's meant to stand in for reproductive strategies that different animals have. The K-type animals are the animals that put a lot of investment in a few offspring, essentially develop very responsible attitudes socially, and they focus down on making sure the next generation is as strong as it possibly can be, whereas the R-types reproduce incredibly quickly with low parental investment, with the understanding that a lot of the next generation will die, but the wild oats have been sown and the genetics will carry on basically through the law of averages. Now, the alt-rights made a lot of hay about this R versus K stuff when it's come to genetics. I'm not an expert. I couldn't tell you whether it's true or not, or whether it's applicable at all to anything like human society. But archetypically, it does have a certain salience to it. Society does seem populated by two different individuals. Some individuals who prefer moral order and responsibility to the next generation, and other individuals that prefer chaotic times, where very little is expected to be delivered to the subsequent generations, because the time frames and time horizons are so limited. Under this archetypical view, we could sort of use the R and K types as analogies, viewing them less like races or reproductive strategies, and almost more like religions. Certain philosophies could be R or K type, and when those philosophies become dominant in societies, those societies might well take on R and K type dynamics in a purely cultural mode. The K-type societies could be contemplative, responsible, moralistic, high trust, low promiscuity, pietistic, and deferential, whereas the R-type societies might be seen as low trust, low time horizon, anti-moralistic, and opportunistic in their expansion. In this sense, the right versus left dynamic can be seen as a cultural war between the K and the R archetype, or the K and the R type cultural religious practices. The association of these different types of ideas and practices to races might be purely sentimental. The association of these different types of societal organization to different ways of divvying up national boundaries or ethnicities in modern nation states might be purely coincidental, might be a pure product of circumstance. The foundational difference between Millennial Woes and Michael Isaacson has nothing to do with race. It has everything to do with the types of society they imagine as being ideal, with Millennial Woes preferring a K-type society, a utopia that looks like Leave It to Beaver, that looks like Jane Austen, and Michael Isaacson preferring an R-type society, a utopia that looks like John Lennon's Imagine, or that looks like primitivist hunter and gatherer style utopias as seen in Avatar. Their association of these desires with whiteness or non-whiteness, in my opinion, is purely sentimental, purely a product of historical circumstance. And this is what I think both Sargon and V are really missing when they say that because both sides practice identity politics, they are essentially very much like each other. The fact that they're practicing identity politics may make them alike in sentimentality as a mistake, but it does not make them alike in ideology. Okay, so I'm sure that most people are thinking, well, I've gone this long digression about how the left and the right have nothing to do with race, even in their most extreme inceptions, how the horseshoe theory is more or less a misunderstanding. How does this explain how Millennial Woes had such a conciliatory meeting with Michael Isaacson, even though he was his diametric opposite, and he had such a contentious meeting with V. Monroe? Well, my explanation is just the following. Millennial Woes and Michael Isaacson realized very, very early on in their conversation that they came from different tribes, that they wanted fundamentally different types of societies. Millennial Woes was from the K-type tribe, and Michael Isaacson was from the R-type tribe. There was really nothing more to say. The remainder of the conversation persisted much more like a negotiation between two different types of people than between two members of the same society, and in many ways that's probably probably what contributed to the incredible perversity that seemed to pervade the conversation. But perverse or not, there certainly wasn't any need for a massive amount of disagreement. They were setting up boundaries. Well, boundaries, at least in Millennial Woes' case. For Isaacson, he was developing conditions along which he might opportunistically try to expand into those boundaries. But I digress. Once the key disagreement was established, there really was no need for anger. The difference was just a fact and could not be overcome. So if that is the case, why was there such a need for anger with V? Well, I think we only really get angry when we think that people are missing something. When we think that they're desiring something not in opposition to our own desires, but in opposition to the constraints of reality itself. I mean, all throughout the conversation between Millennial Woes and V. Monroe, Millennial Woes kept on calling V an atomized individual. You're an atomized individual. You're just an atomized individual. Yeah, I mean, that's the case perhaps, but he didn't feel the need to say that about Michael Isaacson. He might have said it once or twice, but it wasn't a continuing refrain. He never said it like a gotcha, the way he said it to V. And the thing is, I think the frustration just stems from the fact that Millennial Woes could see that V. Monroe did not want a disordered society. He did not want a breakdown of trust and meaning. He did not want to live in John Lennon's Imagine. Millennial Woes could see that in essence, V was a person of the right, a person that would balk at the communism of Michael Isaacson. And as such, the anger was really one of frustration. The fact that he felt that V couldn't see that liberalism and liberty weren't sufficient to carry on the very type of society he wanted. And moreover, that through this blindness, he was in essence driving the society he did have to ruin. In many ways, it's much easier to get angry at a fool than it is to get angry at a villain, or even a monster for that matter. And if I'm honest, as distasteful as I find the concept of racialism, as much as that does not make sense as a category in my own mind, I do sympathize, in essence, of what I perceive to be Millennial Woes' position, because I do think liberalism is insufficient. I do see V. Monroe's position as being the foolery that leads the West to ruin. And I like V. Monroe. I mean, it seems like a guy that would be great to have a beer with, and his view of the world isn't all that screwed up, but he just seems blind. He seems blind like all of the people in the skeptic community. They can't see what's right in front of their nose. Is that deserving of the indignation and the anger that Millennial Woes showed? It might be a little bit of an interaction, but I understand where it's coming from. So that's all I have to really say on this. I know it's been a long, quick take. Have a wonderful night.